Bless you. Light-gated channels. And now our third type, well, first of all, light-gated channels would be found on which of the following locations of the neuron? We talked about this at the very beginning of this unit. The dendrites and the cell body. All right? So we go back and look at our diagram. So the dendrites and dendrite spines and the cell body are the primary, here's the other cell body of another neuron, and that's where the synapses are occurring. So that's where the neurotransmitters are released, and that's the primary site for those channels that bind to those neurotransmitters. Okay? So the axon hillock and the axon itself are where we're going to find the voltage-gated channels. So can I erase the diagram on leak channels? Okay with that one? So voltage-gated channels are like ligand-gated channels, closed unless a particular event occurs. And the event in this time is not a chemical binding to it, but of a current, electrical current, flowing by the protein. Remember how we defined electrical energy? Flow of charged particles. Well, guess what? Ions flowing into a cell or out of a cell is a flow of charged particles. That's what ions are, or charged particles. And so electrical current is passing across the cell membrane anytime we have ions flowing through the cell. That doesn't mean that every cell has voltage-gated channels. Those are limited primarily to our muscle cells and our nerve cells, okay, and some developing cells. And a current flowing by a ligand-gated channel isn't going to open because that's not going to affect the shape of these proteins. So those will open in response to the chemical that's binding to them. So current voltage-gated channels will change their shape, and gates will open or close in response to a change in the current. So here is showing a voltage-gated channel for potassium, and these little paddles that are sensitive to the electrical current can be in up or down positions like that, and that changes the shape and allows or doesn't allow ions to pass through. All right. So here the channel is closed. It's the same type of channel as you saw here. Here the channel is closed, and these paddles are sense positive charges. And the inside of the membrane isn't necessarily, is more negative than the outside. All right, so in this position, the channel is closed. When a positive current flows by on the deep surface of the membrane, that changes the shape and position of the paddles, and they open and allow the potassium ion to flow through. It's not so much a repulsion, well, there might be a repulsion between the charge on the protein itself, but that response to it changes the shape. Okay? We have primarily sodium and potassium voltage-gated channels, all right, when we talk about the function of a neuron. So these, for a sodium channel, which we'll be talking about in a few moments. What color, I don't know what color I drew the sodium channel, but anyway. We have two gates, and typically in a resting position. Red. Thank you. I listen. And watch. So for a sodium voltage-gated channel, we have an activation gate and an inactivation gate. So it actually has two gates. And depending on the current both gates may be closed, both gates may be opened, or one may be closed and one may be open. For potassium, we just have one gate, that is. Right, and these voltage-gated channels are typically, as I said, limited to neurons, to muscle cells, and to some developing embryonic cells. And here's just
neurons, muscle cells, and embryonic.
developing cells. Yes.
Where is the inactivation gate?
The inactivation gate is this one right here. So when the inactivation gate is closed, looks like that. Okay. But typically in the neuron, it's in this position, unless there's an action potential going on, a current traveling through. All right. Then our third type of channel is the mechanically gated channel. Bless you. And this one requires some pressure or stretching, physically changing the membrane of the cell. So some depression. Can you think of one of the cranial nerves that we talked about on Tuesday? It seems like last week, but it was only Tuesday this week. One of the cranial nerves that we talked about on, maybe it was last week, I forget when we did cranial nerves, Thursday or Friday, was mechanically activated. Anybody know which way? The receptors?
Is it the one that attached the eyeball?
That one can be mechanically. It normally is not. It's normally activated by the energy of a photon. But if you push on your eyeball, you can make light. Okay? What's the one that's normally mechanically activated? It's receptors. I'll draw a picture of the receptor and see if you guys recognize at least one of the receptors.
I remember that picture.
So hearing and the vestibulocochlear. So the fluid spinning, all right, or the pressure waves in the cochlea will push on these long folds of plasma membrane and stretch the plasma membrane. That's mechanical activation, right? So it's not a very common one, but we can override, and we can use mechanical energy to open up normally voltage-gated channels or ligand-gated channels. But the inner ear, the cochlea, and the vestibule of the inner ear are the major sources where we do that as a normal function. Okay, so those are the channels. And we use those channels to create changes in the amount of positive and or negative ions on either side of the cell membrane. And that is what allows nerves and muscle cells to be able to respond, to be irritable to stimuli, and to conduct a current. Those are two characteristics shared by muscle and nerve cells: irritability and conductivity. So the resting membrane potential is the potential, the difference in these charges on either side of the membrane, all along the neuron. So at the dendrites, at the cell body, at the axon. And it's due to primarily three conditions or reasons. There are a few others, but these are the three primary ones. One, and I'll diagram them on the board. So here's our plasma membrane. Here is the outside of the cell. Here is the inside of the cell. And this is showing the relative number of positive charges. It's not that we have negative charges so much on the inner surface as we have fewer positive. Okay? So there are some negative charges there, but there are fewer positive charges. And so we have a condition in which the inside of the cell is more negative than the outside of the cell right along the plasma membrane. So it's that relative condition that you see here rather than the actual negative charge components. the negatively charged proteins that are inside the cell. Proteins are too large to pass through membrane channels. Typically, we use exocytosis for them to leave. And so they provide a negative current to the cell, or negative condition. So the result of all of this is going to be the attraction of positive charges to just to the outside, and we have fewer positive charges and some negative charges on the inside. Farther away from the cell, deep in, and farther away from the membrane, deep inside the cell or out in the extracellular fluid, our positive and negative charges are balanced. All right? So we're not saying for the entire cell that there's an unequal balance of positive and negative charges just right at the membrane itself. So this was one reason, okay? Negatively charged proteins. Another reason was the permeability of potassium. Remember I said that we had more potassium leak channels? Then we had sodium leak channels. So with more potassium leak channels, we're going to be losing positive ions. We're going to lose more positive ions than we gain positive ions. So that's what we mean by permeability. It's not that it's soluble in the membrane itself, but it's more likely to cross the membrane. So in this case, we're losing more potassium ions, more positive ions than we're gaining. I should probably change these positive charges here to black because I don't want you thinking these are all potassium ions. So that would be the second reason. Permeability. More permeable to potassium than to sodium. All right, another factor is also going on here because while sodium is going to leak out of the cell, going down its concentration gradient, it never actually reaches an equilibrium, even though we have leaky channels. What prevents it from actually reaching an equilibrium outside the cell compared to inside the cell? What ion?
Sodium.
Sodium. All right. So we have a lot of sodium out here, and not very much potassium. Then that concentration gradient for potassium is going to drive it out. But what other factor is occurring? Concentration gradient is going to drive the potassium ions down their gradient from high to low. But we have additional positive ions outside the cell already. They're sodium. So they're not affecting the concentration gradient of potassium, but they are positive. And positive attracts or repels positive charges. It repels. So where there's a limit to how many more positive ions will move out of the cell because they're being pushed back by the positive ions that are already there, being sodium. Okay? So we have this electrical balance to consider as well as the chemical balance. And that sets a limitation on how many sodium ions will actually move out. So if we just look at the potassium balance, we should have more potassium ions moving out than are. And the reason they don't is because of the positive ions that are already there. All right, the third factor that affects our resting membrane potential We have the negatively charged proteins inside the cell. We have the ion-gated channels, more of which are potassium than are sodium. So more potassium is leaking out than sodium is leaking in. That's shown on this image as well. All right. And then we also have sodium, potassium pumps. Remember the numbers of sodium and potassium involved in this pump? So here's our sodium pump, and it's going to be removing 3 sodium ions. Or how many potassium ions coming in?
2.
2. Of course, this requires ATP. So again, we're losing 1 more positive ion than we are gaining. And so we have a loss of positive ions. So these 3 situations are the 3 major reasons why the inside of the cell has fewer positive ions than the outside of the cell does along the plasma membrane. And this is called the resting membrane potential. So we change that resting membrane potential when we open or close, open ligand-gated channels or open voltage-gated channels. That's going to change this current, right? But as this, it's known as a resting membrane potential. And the resting membrane potential will vary, all right, from neuron to neuron. But for our purposes, we're going to say our typical neuron has a resting membrane potential of minus 70 millivolts. If the resting membrane potential was at 0, what would that mean? That there would be the same number of positive and negative ion charges on either side of the membrane. There would be no difference. Okay. If our resting membrane potential was a positive number, that would mean there were more positive ions inside the cell than outside the cell. Because it is a negative number, that means there are fewer positive ions inside the cell than outside the cell. And the number 70 means that it would take a flow of charged particles equal to the strength of 70 millivolts to bring enough positive ions into the cell to make the difference 0. So if we were to add enough positive ions to the cell so that it had the same number on either side of the membrane, that flow of charged particles into the cell would give us an electrical current of the strength of 70 millivolts. Okay? So that's what that value is. It's a potential. It's not currently flowing into the cell, but if it was to equilibrate, that's the amount of strength that would be required.
Just say that one more time. Okay, so positive is.
So our resting membrane potential is negative because there are fewer positive charges inside the cell along the rest of the membrane than outside. And the number 70 refers to the strength of the current, the value of the number of charges that would have to flow into the cell to bring that to an equal value. So the cell is polarized. Okay? The cell membrane is polarized. There's not an equal number. If it was not polarized, the resting membrane potential would be 0. So that's our resting membrane potential. A lot of students are used to potential meaning ability, and this is just referring to the current. Okay, so the potential is the current required to bring the difference between the positive ions on each side to 0. Now, let's look at this table. And anytime we have a bunch of words instead of pictures, students always freeze. Okay, it's like, oh my goodness, I don't understand this. So let's go slowly. If you understand this, then you've got this down. All right, you've got it down for next semester as well. Some of the terms, maybe new terms, but visually you'll be able to understand what's going on. So, resting membrane potential, okay? When we add positive ions to the cell, which way is this line going to be deflected? It's going to go up. Okay? So, that change, where we're gaining positive ions inside the cell, or it could be due to losing, but it's usually due negative ions, but it's usually due to gaining positive. This change is known as depolarization. We're polarized, and now we're not as far apart in the number of positive ions, and so it's becoming depolarized. If we start to lose those positive ions and we become polarized again, that is referred to as repolarization. And if we are already at a resting membrane potential and we become more negative, then that is referred to as hyperpolarization, where we go even more negative than our normal resting membrane potential. Yes?
So the hyper would be lower than negative 7.
And increase in here refers to an increase in the difference between the resting membrane potential and 0, or what our threshold would be. So it doesn't mean it's rising, it's an increase in, so if this is our, so if we, well, I'll draw and illustrate what we talk about, because when you say increase, we think things go up, and it's actually going farther away from
Relative to
0.
the base that
Right.
you're talking about.
Okay, so let's say that I'm a nurse noir. I go around killing patients by injecting them with potassium chloride. Okay, actually have a case study next semester, or true case study, a couple in Florida, where the husband, he's still alive, was the doctor. He was the medical examiner in a county in Florida, and he and his wife were having, she didn't know they were having problems, but apparently they were, because he had a longtime mistress. And he and his wife had gone out to dinner that night, and the waitress said they seemed happy and she seemed fine. And he got up the next morning and went to work and tried to call home. She didn't answer, and his daughter didn't answer, so he sent some of his employees from the coroner's office home, and she was found dead in her bed. And anybody that dies out, not under a doctor's care, or even at home under a doctor's care, typically the state laws require that they be autopsied. And he did not have his wife autopsied, he had her cremated. And so people started to talk, and they found out about the mistress, and he was charged with her murder. A hypodermic syringe had been found with her blood in it in a dumpster away from the house. And he said, oh, well, you know, whenever the family was sick, he would always draw blood from them to do blood tests on. Why it was not in the needle wasn't in the house, and was, you know, outside the house, he really couldn't answer. And so he was charged with her murder, and the thought was that because she was cremated, they couldn't find any injection sites, but the thought was that he had injected her with potassium chloride. He was later actually charged, which would affect heart and nerve. He was later actually charged with injecting her with succinyl chloride, which was it's been in the Midwest. But probably the most latest case was about 5 years ago in Nevada, where the former controller was thought to have been killed by, that's a complicated case. Her husband died, she married her husband's caregiver, and he apparently killed her using the succinyl chloride. He was a former ER nurse. And so the guy actually eventually got off because they said that the doctor, they said that they had body fluids that they had taken before she was cremated, and they said, well, that amount that was, the chemical that was in there could have been caused by chemical reactions that occurred after the death. So he married his mistress and moved to Texas and started a new life. But potassium chloride is a common, your body is something that's normally found in your body, and levels change with disease, and so it's commonly used by individuals that have access to medical fluids.